Thomas Whitaker wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked at the empty field stretching before him. The sun was setting, painting the New Mexico sky in shades of orange and red, but he couldn't enjoy the beauty. His mind was too busy worrying about everything that was falling apart around him. The cattle were getting thinner each day because there wasn't enough water. The barn had holes in the roof that he couldn't afford to fix. His hands were rough and bleeding from trying to do the work of 3 men all by himself. At 42 years old, Thomas had finally admitted something he'd been avoiding for years. He couldn't do this alone anymore. 6 months ago, he'd done something he never thought he'd do. He wrote a letter to a matrimonial agency back in St. Louis. It felt strange, almost shameful, to look for a wife through the mail like ordering supplies from a catalog. But what choice did he have? Women were scarce out here, and he needed help desperately. The agency had matched him with a woman named Margaret. She was a widow, 38 years old, who'd lost her husband to cholera. She knew how to cook, clean, and manage a household. The letters they exchanged were practical, not romantic. She needed security. He needed a partner. It seemed like a fair arrangement. Thomas had spent the last week preparing for her arrival. He'd cleaned the house until his back ached. He'd fixed the broken chair in the kitchen. He'd even tried to wash the curtains, though they still looked pretty worn out. Today was the day she was supposed to arrive on the supply wagon from Santa Fe. He kept checking his only good shirt, making sure it was still clean. His hands were shaking a little, though he'd never admit it out loud. What would she think of him? What would she think of this struggling ranch? Would she take one look and want to go right back to St. Louis? The sound of wagon wheels made his heart jump. Thomas walked toward the front of his property, trying to look calm and confident even though he felt like a nervous boy. The wagon was coming up the dusty road, pulled by 2 tired-looking mules. The driver was old Pete from the trading post, a man who'd been running supplies for 20 years. Thomas raised his hand in greeting and walked faster. This was it? His whole life was about to change. He'd rehearsed what he wanted to say 100 times in his head. Something simple and welcoming. Something that would put her at ease. But as the wagon came to a stop and the dust settled, Thomas felt his prepared words die in his throat. The person climbing down from the wagon wasn't Margaret. In fact, it wasn't just one person at all. 3 women stepped down, one after another, and they were unlike any women Thomas had ever seen. Each one was tall, incredibly tall, standing well over 6 feet. They were Apache, with long, dark hair and strong features. They moved with confidence, their boots hitting the ground with solid thumps. Thomas just stood there, his mouth hanging open like a fool. He couldn't form words. He couldn't even close his mouth properly. What was happening? Where was Margaret? The oldest of the 3 women walked straight up to him. She was probably in her mid-30s, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through him. She held out a crumpled piece of paper. Thomas took it with trembling hands. The letter was written in shaky handwriting he didn't recognize. It explained that Margaret had gotten sick with fever while traveling through Santa Fe. She'd died 3 weeks ago. Thomas felt a wave of sadness wash over him, even though he'd never met the woman. She'd been hoping for a new start, just like him. But the letter continued. These 3 Apache sisters had been working as laundresses at the military fort in Santa Fe. They'd somehow learned about Margaret's arrangement with Thomas. When she died, they'd approached the matrimonial agency and purchased her contract. They'd paid with every penny they'd saved over years of hard work. The oldest sister began to speak. Her English was perfect, clear, and precise. My name is Nalan. These are my sisters, Doba and Kimi. We need a place to stay. We need protection. We can work harder than any man you've ever hired. Thomas looked at the 3 of them. Doba, who appeared to be in her early 30s, had shoulders like a blacksmith. Even standing still, she looked incredibly strong. Kimi, the youngest, seemed to be in her early 20s. She had kind eyes but held herself with the alertness of someone always watching for danger. I was expecting, Thomas stammered, feeling stupid as soon as the words left his mouth. You were expecting Margaret, Nalan said flatly. Margaret is dead. We are here instead. We know this is not what you planned. but we can make it worth your while." Old Pete cleared his throat from the wagon. "They paid full passage, Thomas. Paid in silver coins. I checked them myself. Whatever you decide, I need to get going before dark." Thomas's mind was racing. This was impossible. This was crazy. He'd arranged for one practical widow, and instead, 3 Apache women were standing in front of his ranch. His neighbors would lose their minds. The people in town would never let him hear the end of it. But then he thought about something else. The Carver brothers who owned the ranch to the east had been pressuring him for months to sell his water rights. They'd made threats. They'd accidentally let their cattle destroy his fence twice. Just last week, the older Carver had told him that accidents happen to men who live alone. No one would dare bother a ranch where 3 Apache women lived. The Carvers might be mean, but they weren't stupid. 3 months, Thomas heard himself say. A trial period. You work the ranch, help with everything that needs doing. I provide shelter and food. After 3 months, we see if it's working out. Nolan studied his face for a long moment, then nodded once. Fair enough. The sisters began unloading their belongings from the wagon. They didn't have much. A few bundles of clothes, some cooking pots, blankets, and a rifle case. They worked together smoothly, like they'd done this many times before, each one knowing exactly what the others needed without speaking. Thomas showed them to the barn. You can sleep here for now. It's clean, and there's hay for bedding. Tomorrow we'll figure out something better. Kimi ran her hand along the barn wall, checking its strength. Doba looked up at the roof, clearly noting the holes that needed fixing. Nolan simply nodded and began organizing their space. That night, Thomas lay in his bed in the main house, staring at the ceiling. He could hear the quiet sounds of the sisters settling into the barn. What had he just agreed to? His ranch hands, Julio and Paco, were due to arrive at dawn. They were good men, Mexican vaqueros who'd worked with him for 3 years. But how would they react to this? How would anyone react to this? Thomas closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind kept spinning with questions and worries. He'd been lonely for so long, desperate for help, dreaming of a simple partnership with a widow who understood hard work. Instead, 3 giant Apache sisters had stepped off that wagon, and his life would never be the same again. Whether that was good or bad, Thomas had no idea. He'd find out soon enough. Thomas woke up before sunrise, just like he did every morning. But this morning felt different. His stomach was tight with nervousness as he remembered what had happened yesterday. 3 Apache women were sleeping in his barn. His hired hands would be arriving any minute. This could go very wrong, very quickly. He splashed cold water on his face and got dressed quickly. Through the window, he could already see smoke rising from the direction of the barn. The sisters were awake. He could smell something cooking, something that made his mouth water even though his stomach was churning with worry. Julio and Paco arrived right on time, riding their horses up the path as the sun started peeking over the hills. They were good men, both in their 30s, with families of their own in the Mexican settlement about 10 miles south. Thomas had always paid them fairly and treated them with respect, and they'd returned that respect with loyalty and hard work. Thomas walked out to meet them, trying to figure out how to explain the situation. But before he could say anything, the barn door opened and the 3 sisters stepped out into the morning light. Julio's horse spooked, nearly throwing him off. Paco went completely still, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife on his belt. Both men stared with their mouths open. Buenos dias, Nolan said calmly, as if this was the most normal situation in the world. There is coffee and food if you are hungry. Julio found his voice first, speaking in Spanish to Paco in a rapid, shocked whisper. Thomas caught enough words to understand what they were saying. Who are they? Are they prisoners? Is the boss crazy? Should we leave? Julio, Paco, Thomas called out, his voice stronger than he felt. These are Nolan, Doba, and Kimi. They're going to be working here on the ranch for a while. I'd appreciate it if you'd help them learn how we do things around here. Paco looked at Thomas like he'd lost his mind. Boss, are you sure about this? You know how people in town are going to react, right? The Carver brothers, the preacher, everyone. I know, Thomas said quietly. But it's my ranch and these women need work. They need a safe place to stay. And honestly, I need the help. Doba had walked over to a large wooden beam that had fallen near the corral 3 weeks ago. Thomas had been planning to get help moving it, since it was too heavy for one man to lift. She bent down, got a grip on it, and lifted it onto her shoulder like it weighed nothing more than a sack of flour. Julio's eyes went wide. He turned to Paco and said something in Spanish that made both of them laugh nervously. Then Julio looked back at Thomas and shrugged. Well, boss, maybe God sent you some help after all, just strange-looking angels, yes? The tension broke a little. They all sat down to eat the breakfast Nolan had prepared. She'd made some kind of flat bread that was crispy on the outside and soft inside, along with beans mixed with spices Thomas had never tasted before. There were also eggs from Thomas's chickens, cooked perfectly. This is really good, Paco said, speaking carefully in English so the sisters could understand. My wife, she is a great cook, but this is different. Good different. Nolan nodded her thanks but didn't smile. None of the sisters smiled, Thomas noticed. They were polite but distant, like they were keeping a wall between themselves and everyone else. After breakfast, they got to work. Thomas laid out the day's tasks. The north fence needed repair. Several cattle needed to be moved to better grazing. The barn roof desperately needed patching before the next rain. It was enough work for 5 men, and they only had 5 people, but 3 of them were women who'd never worked a ranch before. At least that's what Thomas assumed. He was wrong. Kimmy asked to see the horses. Thomas took her to the corral where he kept 6 horses, including his stallion Devil. The horse was mean-tempered and had bitten 2 ranch hands over the years. Thomas only rode him because the animal was strong and fast, but it was always a battle. Kimmy climbed over the fence and walked right up to Devil. Thomas started to warn her, but Julio grabbed his arm. Wait, the vaquero said. Just watch. Devil snorted and pawed the ground, warning the stranger to back off. Kimmy stopped a few feet away and began making a low humming sound. It wasn't quite singing, not quite talking, just a steady, calm noise that seemed to vibrate in the air. The horse's ears pricked forward. Kimmy took 1 step closer, still making that sound. Devil tossed his head but didn't move away. Another step. The humming continued, steady and peaceful. Then Kimmy held out her hand, palm flat. Devil stretched out his neck, sniffed her hand suspiciously, then gently took something from her palm. Thomas hadn't even seen her holding anything, but the horse was now chewing contentedly. Within 5 minutes, Kimmy was scratching Devil behind the ears, while the stallion stood there, like a gentle puppy. Thomas felt his jaw drop for the 2nd time in 2 days. She has magic, Paco whispered, making the sign of the cross. Not magic, Nolan said from behind them. They all jumped. None of them had heard her approach. Our father trained horses. He taught Kimmy since she was small. Animals sense fear. Kimmy has no fear of them, so they have no fear of her. While Kimmy worked with the horses, Doba tackled the barn roof. She climbed up there with tools and spare wood, moving across the steep slope like she was walking on flat ground. By midday, half the holes were patched. Work that Thomas had expected to take 3 days was getting done in hours. Nolan worked alongside Thomas and the vaqueros on the fence repair. She didn't know much about ranching, but she learned fast. After Thomas showed her once how to tie the wire properly, she could do it herself. Her hands moved quickly and efficiently, never wasting motion. You said you worked as laundresses at the fort, Thomas said as they worked. How did you learn to speak English so well? Nolan's face hardened slightly. Missionaries came to our village when I was young. They taught us to read and write. They said we needed to learn the white man's ways to survive in the white man's world. She paused, pulling a wire tight. They were right about that, at least. Thomas wanted to ask more, but something in her tone told him not to push. These women had stories, painful ones, and they would share them if and when they were ready. By late afternoon, more work had been accomplished than Thomas had seen in weeks. The fence was repaired. The barn roof was nearly finished. The horses had been exercised and groomed. Even the house looked cleaner because Nolan had spent her lunch break sweeping and organizing. Julio pulled Thomas aside as they were finishing up for the day. Boss, I have to tell you something. My wife, she heard rumors in town yesterday. People already know about the women. Someone from the supply company must have talked. The preacher is apparently very upset. And the Carver brothers, he shook his head. They are telling everyone that you are running some kind of savage camp here. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest. Let them talk. These women are working honestly for honest pay. There's nothing wrong with that. I agree with you, boss, Julio said carefully. But you need to be prepared. Town is only 12 miles away. Word spreads fast, and not everyone will see it the way you do. That evening, Thomas sat on his porch while the sisters prepared their own meal in the barn. They were keeping their distance, he realized. They worked hard, did everything asked of them, but they didn't try to be friendly. They didn't share stories or jokes. When the work was done, they disappeared into the barn like ghosts. He wondered about their life before. What had they seen? What had they survived? Why did 3 strong, capable women need to buy a mail-order bride contract just to find a safe place to stay? As darkness fell, Thomas noticed something strange. The sisters left the barn, moving quietly toward the hills beyond his property. Each carried a bag. They moved like shadows, barely making a sound. Where were they going? Thomas almost followed them, but stopped himself. They'd earned some privacy. If they wanted him to know where they went, they'd tell him. Besides, they'd be back. They had nowhere else to go. He went inside and tried to sleep. Tomorrow he needed to ride into town for supplies. That's when he'd face the gossip, the judgment, the anger of people who thought they knew better than he did about his own ranch. Thomas wasn't looking forward to it, but he'd made his choice. 3 Apache sisters had stepped off that wagon, and he'd given them his word that they could stay for 3 months. He wasn't the kind of man who broke his word, no matter how much pressure people put on him. Outside in the barn, the 3 sisters sat together in the darkness. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. They'd survived worse than small-town gossip. They'd survived things these ranchers and townspeople couldn't imagine, for now they had shelter. They had work, and they had each other. That was enough. That had to be enough. 2 weeks had passed since the sisters arrived, and Thomas's ranch had never looked better. The fences were solid. The barn was completely repaired. The horses were healthier and calmer than they'd been in years. Even the house had a cleaner, more organized feel to it, though the sisters still refused to sleep anywhere except the barn. Thomas had moved some old furniture out there, trying to make it more comfortable for them. He'd brought extra blankets and a small stove for cooking. But the sisters remained distant, polite but guarded. They worked from sunrise to sunset, never complaining, never asking for anything beyond the basic necessities. Every Sunday, they disappeared into the hills for several hours. They always came back with wild herbs, rabbit, or turkey for meat, and sometimes plants Thomas didn't recognize. Nalin would spend Sunday evenings making medicines and drying herbs. When Thomas asked what they were for, she simply said, "For healing. For staying healthy." He'd been putting off going into town, but he couldn't avoid it any longer. They needed flour, sugar, salt, and other supplies. He also needed to check on an order for new tools that should have arrived from back east. On a Thursday morning, Thomas hitched up his wagon and prepared for the 12-mile journey to Clearwater Ridge. As he was checking the harness, Nalin approached him. "You are going to town," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, need supplies. Should be back by evening." She studied his face for a moment. "They will say things about us." "Bad things. Things that are not true." Thomas met her eyes. "I expect they will. But I'm not ashamed of the arrangement we have here. You work hard and honest. That's all that matters to me." Something flickered in Nalin's expression, almost like surprise, but it was gone before Thomas could be sure. She nodded once and walked back to where her sisters were working on the corral. The ride to Clearwater Ridge took about 3 hours. It was a small town, just one main street with a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a small schoolhouse, and a saloon. Most of the 200 or so people who called it home were ranchers, farmers, or workers at the nearby copper mine. Thomas had always gotten along well enough with folks here. He wasn't particularly friendly or chatty, but he paid his bills on time and didn't cause trouble. People respected that, or at least they used to. The moment he drove his wagon onto Main Street, he felt the change. People stopped what they were doing to stare. 2 women who'd been talking in front of the general store saw him and quickly went inside, whispering urgently. A group of men outside the saloon went quiet, watching him with cold eyes. Thomas tied up his wagon in front of Vernon Polk's general store. Vernon had run the place for 20 years and had always been fair in his dealings. Thomas pushed open the door and the little bell above it rang cheerfully, a sound that felt out of place given the tension in the air. Vernon was behind the counter, sorting through a delivery of canned goods. He looked up when Thomas entered, and his friendly expression died immediately. The other customers in the store, 3 women Thomas recognized from church, stopped talking and stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "Vernon," Thomas said with a nod, trying to act normal. "Got my list here. Need to stock up on some basics." Vernon took the list but didn't look at it. "Thomas, I need to talk to you about something." "All right, but can we fill this order first? I've got a long ride back. That's what I need to talk about." Vernon set the list down. "I can't serve you anymore." Thomas felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "What?" One of the women spoke up, her voice sharp with judgment. "Everyone knows what you're doing out there, Thomas Whitaker, housing those savage women under your roof. It's shameful. It's sinful. Preacher Hutchins says you're setting a bad example for the whole community." "They're not under my roof," Thomas said, his voice tight. "They're working on my ranch. They sleep in the barn. They earn their keep with honest labor." "That's not what we heard," another woman said. "We heard you brought them here to—" "Well, we know what men do with women like that." Thomas's face burned with anger and humiliation. "You don't know anything. They're good workers who needed a safe place to stay. That's all." Vernon shook his head sadly. "Thomas, I've got a business to run. My wife is upset. Reverend Hutchins is upset. Half the town is talking about bringing this up at the next town council meeting. I can't afford to be associated with whatever it is you're doing out there." "I'm not doing anything wrong," Thomas said, his voice rising despite his effort to stay calm. "They work for me. I pay them fairly. That's the whole story." "Then why didn't you hire normal folk?" one of the women demanded. "Why Apache? Everyone knows they can't be trusted. Remember what happened to the Patterson family 5 years ago? That was a raiding party from 200 miles away." Thomas shot back. "These women had nothing to do with that. They're just trying to survive." Vernon sighed and pushed Thomas's list back across the counter. "I'm sorry, Thomas, but I can't help you. You need to make a choice. Either send those women away or find somewhere else to do your business." Thomas stood there shaking with anger and disbelief. These were people he'd known for years. People he'd helped when their own ranches were struggling. People he'd sat next to in church, and now they were turning their backs on him over rumors and prejudice. He looked at each person in the store, memorizing their faces. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out enough money to cover everything on his list. He set it on the counter with a loud clink. "That's what I owe you, Vernon. Now I'm taking my supplies, whether you want to serve me or not." Vernon opened his mouth to protest, but something in Thomas's expression stopped him. Thomas began gathering what he needed from the shelves. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, dried beans. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody spoke. They just watched him with cold, judgmental eyes. When he had everything loaded in his wagon, Thomas climbed onto the seat. Before he could leave, a voice called out to him. "Thomas Whitaker." Reverend Hutchins was striding down the street, his long black coat flapping behind him. He was a thin man in his 50s with gray hair and the kind of piercing eyes that made everyone in his congregation uncomfortable. "I need to speak with you. I've got nothing to say to you, Reverend, but I have something to say to you." The Reverend stopped beside the wagon, looking up at Thomas with righteous anger. "You are harboring heathens on land that good Christian people settled. You are giving comfort to the very people who murdered innocent families. Do you have no shame? No conscience?" "Those women never hurt anybody," Thomas said through gritted teeth. "They're just trying to live their lives in peace. They are Apache," the Reverend spat the word like it was poison. "They worship false gods. They live in sin. And you, by allowing them to stay on your land, are participating in that sin. The Bible is very clear about this, Thomas. Very clear." A crowd was gathering now. Thomas could see the Carver brothers pushing their way to the front. Robert and William Carver owned the big ranch to the east of Thomas's property. They'd been trying to buy him out for 2 years, especially wanting his water rights. They were big men, mean-spirited, the kind who used their size and influence to get what they wanted. "Well, well," Robert Carver called out with a nasty grin. "If it isn't Thomas and his Apache harem. Tell me, Thomas, do they dance for you? Do they do those wild dances we've heard about?" Several men in the crowd laughed. Thomas's hands tightened on the reins until his knuckles turned white. "Watch your mouth, Robert." "Or what?" William Carver stepped forward. "You going to have your savage women protect you? Everyone knows you're too weak to run that ranch alone. That's why you had to import help. What kind of man does that?" The kind of man who minds his own business, Thomas shot back. Something you two never learned how to do. Robert's grin faded. You're making a mistake, Thomas. A big one. That land of yours, especially that creek, it's valuable. But who's going to want to deal with a man who lives with savages? You're making yourself an outcast. Pretty soon, you won't be able to sell your cattle, won't be able to get supplies, won't be able to do business with anyone. Then I'll do business somewhere else, Thomas said. Santa Fe will sell to me, so will Albuquerque. That's a long way to travel, William said menacingly. Lots of things can happen on lonely roads, accidents, unfortunate accidents. The threat hung in the air. Thomas looked at the crowd surrounding him. Some faces showed agreement with the Carvers. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. A few, like old Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, looked sympathetic but were too afraid to speak up. I'm leaving now, Thomas said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. I came here for supplies and I got them. I paid for them fairly. If any of you have a problem with how I run my ranch, that's your concern, not mine. Those women are under my protection, and they're staying as long as they want to stay. He snapped the reins and his horse started forward. The crowd parted reluctantly. As Thomas drove out of town, he could hear the buzz of conversation starting up behind him, everyone talking at once about what had just happened. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than usual. Thomas's mind was churning. The town had turned against him completely. The Carvers had made veiled threats. Even the Reverend had condemned him publicly. What had he gotten himself into? Summer was ending and everyone could feel the change in the air. The heat was still fierce during the day, but the nights were getting cooler. The sky seemed bigger somehow, filled with clouds that promised rain but never delivered. The land was thirsty, the grass turning brown, and Thomas worried constantly about his cattle. It had been 6 weeks since the sisters arrived. The 3-month trial period was almost halfway done, and Thomas couldn't imagine the ranch without them anymore. Kimi had trained 2 young horses that Thomas had thought were too wild to be useful. Doba had not only fixed everything that was broken, but had improved things, making them stronger than they'd been originally. And Nolan ran the household with an efficiency that amazed him, but they still kept their distance. Every Sunday, they disappeared into the hills. They were polite but never truly friendly. They worked hard but rarely spoke unless necessary. It was like living with 3 ghosts who happened to be incredibly useful. Julio had noticed it too. One afternoon, while they were checking the cattle in the south pasture, he mentioned it to Thomas. Boss, those women, they are good workers. Maybe the best I've ever seen. But they are like, how do I say it? Like animals that have been hurt badly. Always ready to run. Always watching for danger. Thomas had thought the same thing, but hearing Julio say it out loud made it more real. They've been through something terrible, that much is obvious. My wife, she says we should invite them to dinner, show them friendship, but I don't know if they would come. Probably not, Thomas agreed. But it's kind of you to think of it. The storm came on a Thursday night in late August. Thomas had seen bad weather before, but this was different. The sky turned a sick green color just before sunset. The wind picked up so fast it nearly tore his hat off. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in half an hour. Get the horses into the barn, Thomas shouted to Kimi over the howling wind. Julio, Paco, we need to secure everything that's not tied down. They all worked frantically as the storm approached. The wind was screaming now, bending trees nearly double. Then the rain came. Not gradually, but all at once, like someone had dumped an ocean from the sky. Within minutes, Thomas was soaked to the bone. Lightning cracked across the sky so bright it hurt to look at. Thunder followed immediately, shaking the ground under their feet. This wasn't just a storm. This was something dangerous. Thomas's mind went to the cattle. He had about 60 head in the north pasture near the creek. If the creek flooded, and it looked like it would, those animals could be trapped or swept away. He couldn't afford to lose them. They represented everything he had left. The north pasture, he shouted to Julio and Paco. We need to move those cattle now. Both men looked at him like he was crazy. Boss, in this storm, it's suicide. If we don't, they'll drown or get washed away. I'm going. You don't have to come. But of course they came. That's the kind of men they were. The three of them saddled up fresh horses and rode out into the teeth of the storm. The rain was so heavy, Thomas could barely see 10 feet ahead. The lightning was constant now, turning night into day every few seconds. They made it to the north pasture to find exactly what Thomas had feared. The creek had already overflowed its banks. Water was rising fast, and the cattle were panicking, running in circles, some of them already in water up to their chests. If they didn't act fast, they'd lose the whole herd. "We need to get ropes on them, drive them toward higher ground," Thomas shouted, but the wind tore his words away. They tried. They really did, but it was too much for 3 men. The cattle were too panicked, the water too high, the storm too fierce. Thomas felt desperation clawing at his chest. This was it. He was going to lose everything. Then, through the sheets of rain, he saw 3 figures on horseback riding toward them at full speed. The sisters. They'd seen what was happening and come to help without being asked. Doba rode her horse straight into the deepest water without hesitation. She had a rope and managed to get it around a young steer that was starting to go under. With strength that seemed impossible, she pulled the animal toward higher ground while her horse fought against the current. Kimmy was making sounds, that same humming singing noise she used with the horses. Incredibly, some of the cattle seemed to respond to it even through their panic. They began following her as she guided her horse toward safety. Nalin rode alongside Thomas. "We drive them east," she shouted. "Away from the creek, we make them run." Together, the 6 of them worked as one unit. It was dangerous, terrifying work. The lightning struck so close at one point that Thomas's horse reared and nearly threw him. The water was chest deep on the horses in some places. But slowly, gradually, they got the cattle moving in the right direction. It took hours. Thomas lost track of time. All he knew was rain, wind, lightning, and the desperate need to save his herd. His hands were numb from holding the reins. His voice was raw from shouting. But they kept going. Finally, as suddenly as it had started, the worst of the storm began to ease. The rain lessened. The wind dropped. The lightning moved away toward the mountains. In the gray dawn light, Thomas counted his cattle. They'd lost 4, swept away before anyone could reach them. But 56 had been saved. Without the sisters' help, he would have lost them all. Everyone was exhausted, soaked, and shivering. They rode back to the ranch in silence, too tired to speak. When they got there, Thomas knew they all needed to get dry and warm immediately, or risk getting dangerously cold. "Everyone inside the house," he ordered. "Now, no arguments." For once, the sisters didn't protest. They were shaking with cold and exhaustion. Thomas got a fire going in the fireplace while Nalin, moving on pure instinct, started making hot coffee and soup. Julio and Paco huddled near the fire, gradually stopping their shivering. As warmth slowly returned and the adrenaline faded, they all sat around Thomas's small kitchen table wrapped in blankets, drinking coffee and eating soup. The storm still raged outside, but it was distant now, moving away. Thomas looked at the 3 sisters. Their hair was plastered to their heads. Their eyes were red with exhaustion, but they'd risked their lives to save his cattle. They could have stayed safe in the barn. Instead, they'd ridden into danger without hesitation. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You saved my ranch tonight. You saved everything I have." Nalin wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, staring into the steam rising from it. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then she looked up at Thomas with eyes that held years of pain. "7 years ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "soldiers came to our village. It was early morning. Most people were still sleeping. They said we had been stealing cattle. It wasn't true. We never stole anything. But they didn't care about truth." Doba and Kimi had gone very still. This was clearly a story they didn't tell often, maybe never. "They burned everything," Nalin continued. "Every home, every building. They shot anyone who ran. We only survived because we were in the mountains gathering wood for the winter. We heard the gunshots. We smelled the smoke. By the time we got back, it was over. Our mother, our father, our younger brother, our grandparents, everyone was gone." Thomas felt his throat tighten. Julio and Paco had tears in their eyes. The fort commander, he felt guilty, I think, Nalin said. Or maybe he was just afraid we would tell people what really happened. He gave us work at the fort. Washing clothes, cooking, cleaning. We worked hard, we saved every penny, but the soldiers, they looked at us like we were animals. Some of them wanted things from us, things we would not give. Doba spoke for the first time, her voice rough. One captain, he said we should be grateful. Grateful that they let us live, grateful that they gave us work. He said we should show our gratitude in special ways. We refused, Kimmy added softly. So they made our lives difficult, gave us the worst jobs, paid us less, made sure everyone knew we were Apache as if that was something shameful. Nalin took a shaky breath. We were planning to leave for months. Then we heard about Margaret, the woman who was supposed to come here. When she died, we saw an opportunity. We used all our money to buy her contract. The agency didn't care who went as long as someone fulfilled the agreement. We just wanted to get away from the fort. We wanted somewhere safe to work and live. That's all. The room was silent except for the crackling of the fire and the distant rumble of thunder. Thomas felt angry tears building behind his eyes. These women had lost everything. They'd survived a massacre. They'd been treated like criminals for the crime of being born Apache. And still, they'd worked hard, saved their money, and tried to build a new life. "You're safe here," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "As long as I'm alive, you're safe on this ranch. 3 months, 3 years, 3 decades. I don't care. This is your home now if you want it to be." Nalin looked at him for a long time, searching his face for any sign of deception. Finally, she nodded. A single tear ran down her cheek, the first emotion Thomas had seen from her beyond wariness. "We will work hard," she said. "We will prove we are worth your protection." "You already have," Thomas replied. They sat together. As the storm finally passed, exhausted but somehow lighter, a wall had come down tonight, washed away by rain and flood and shared danger. The sisters were no longer just workers keeping their distance. Fall arrived with crisp mornings and golden afternoons. The ranch had never looked better or run more smoothly. Thomas's cattle were healthy and well-fed. The buildings were all repaired. Even his small vegetable garden was producing more than he'd ever managed to grow before, thanks to Nalin's knowledge of plants and growing seasons. The 3-month trial period had come and gone without anyone mentioning it. The sisters simply stayed, and Thomas never suggested they should leave. They'd moved out of the barn and into a small cabin on the property that had once belonged to a ranch hand. With Doba's help, they'd fixed it up until it was comfortable and weatherproof. Things had changed between all of them after the night of the storm. The sisters still kept some privacy, still disappeared into the hills on Sundays, but they were more open now. They talked during meals. Kimmy actually laughed sometimes, a sound that made everyone smile. Doba, who rarely spoke, had started teaching Thomas some Apache words, and Nalin had begun sharing her extensive knowledge of medicine and healing herbs. Thomas caught himself watching Nalin sometimes when she wasn't looking. The way she moved, efficient and graceful, the way she thought through problems logically, the rare times she smiled, how it transformed her whole face. He'd stopped thinking of her as just a worker a long time ago, though he wasn't sure exactly when it happened. In early October, Thomas took his cattle to the Territorial Fair in Santa Fe. It was a big event where ranchers from all over came to show their animals and make sales. Thomas was nervous because he knew people would be talking about him and the sisters, but he needed to make these sales to survive. To his surprise and delight, his cattle won 3 blue ribbons. The judges couldn't argue with the quality of the animals. They were well-fed, healthy, and strong. Thomas sold 15 head for excellent prices. For the first time in years, he had real money in his pocket. On the ride back, he felt proud and hopeful. Maybe things were going to work out after all. Maybe the quality of his work would speak louder than the town's gossip. He was wrong. The trouble came on a Saturday night in late October. Thomas had gone to bed early, exhausted from a long day's work. Around midnight, he was jolted awake by the sound of horses and men's voices, lots of them. He grabbed his rifle and looked out the window. His blood ran cold. There were at least 8 riders surrounding his property, all carrying torches. In the flickering light, he recognized the Carver brothers at the front of the group. Thomas rushed outside. "What's going on here?" "Get off my land!" Robert Carver urged his horse forward, a nasty grin on his face. The torchlight made him look like something from a nightmare. "Well, Thomas, we've come to have a discussion with you. About your situation here. There's nothing to discuss. Get out." "See, we disagree," William Carver said. "You made a mockery of this whole territory at the fair, winning ribbons with cattle raised by savages, making honest ranchers look bad. People are starting to ask questions, starting to wonder if maybe they should hire Apache too." "That's my fault, how?" Thomas demanded, his rifle ready but not yet aimed. "You're setting a bad example," Robert continued, "and we can't have that. So we're going to help you out. We're going to burn that cabin where those women live. They'll run off and things can go back to normal." "Over my dead body," Thomas said, his voice deadly calm. "That can be arranged," one of the hired guns said from the back. Thomas was trying to figure out his next move when he heard a sound that made his heart stop. 3 rifle bolts clicking into place, the sound echoing in the night. "You will leave now." Nolan's voice came from the darkness near the barn. "Or we will shoot." The torches swung around and Thomas saw them. The 3 sisters, positioned in different locations around the property. Each one had a rifle, and from the way they held them, they clearly knew how to use them. Well, Robert Carver said, though he sounded less confident now. "The savages are armed. That's probably illegal." "I don't care about your laws," Nolan said coldly. "You come onto our land with torches and threats. Where we come from, that means you want to kill us. We will defend ourselves." "Your land?" William laughed, but it sounded forced. "You don't own anything. You're just workers." "This is our home," Doba said from her position near the corral. Her voice was quiet but carried in the night air. "We will protect our home." Thomas saw some of the hired guns starting to look nervous. They'd probably been promised easy money to scare off some women. They hadn't expected armed resistance. Then Kimi did something that changed everything. She began speaking in Apache, her voice rising and falling in a traditional chant. Thomas didn't understand the words, but he understood the effect. The horses started getting nervous, dancing and pulling at their bits. One of the hired gun's horses reared, nearly throwing its rider. "She's putting a curse on us," one man shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Don't be stupid," Robert snarled. "It's just noise." But more of the horses were acting up now. Kimi's chant grew louder, more rhythmic. The torches cast wild shadows. The whole scene looked like something from a nightmare, and the men were starting to panic. "Boss, I didn't sign up for this," one of the hired guns said to Robert. "You said we were just going to scare some women. Nobody said anything about a fight with armed savages who curse people." "Yeah, I'm out," another one agreed. 2 of them turned their horses and rode away into the darkness. The Carver brothers were left with only 4 men now, and those 4 looked like they wanted to leave too. Robert's face was red with rage and embarrassment. "This isn't over, Whitaker," he spat. "We'll find another way. You can't protect them forever." "Watch me," Thomas said. "You're making powerful enemies. People who can make your life very difficult. Legal difficulties. Business difficulties. You won't be able to sell your cattle. Won't be able to get supplies. We'll squeeze you until you have nothing left. Then I'll have nothing left. But I won't be the kind of coward who threatens women in the night. Get off my land, Robert. Don't come back." For a moment, Thomas thought it might come to shooting. The tension was thick enough to cut. But then Robert yanked his horse around and kicked it hard. "Let's go. We'll handle this another way." The remaining men followed him, leaving Thomas and the sisters standing in the darkness, their rifles still ready. They waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely before lowering their weapons. Thomas walked over to where Nolan was standing. His hands were shaking, though he tried to hide it. "That was close. Too close." "They will come back," Nolan said matter-of-factly. "Men like that, they do not give up. Let them come. Next time I'll be ready." Doba appeared out of the shadows. "We are sorry we brought this trouble to you." "You didn't bring trouble. The trouble was already here. The Carvers have been trying to force me off this land for 2 years. You gave me a reason to fight back." Kimi joined them, and Thomas noticed she was still shaking a little. "I was scared," she admitted. "But I remembered what our father used to say. Show no fear to your enemies even if your heart is pounding." "That chanting you did," Thomas said. "That was smart. Spooked them good." Kimi smiled slightly. "It was a children's song about rabbits playing in the moonlight." But they didn't know that. Despite the tension, Thomas almost laughed. These women were full of surprises. They just faced down 8 armed men without flinching. They'd stood their ground and protected their home. Their home. That's what this place had become for all of them. "Come on," Thomas said. "Let's get some coffee. None of us are sleeping anymore tonight anyway." They gathered in Thomas's house, something that was happening more often now. As Nolan made coffee, they talked about what to do next. The Carvers had made threats about using legal means to cause problems. Thomas knew they had connections, money, and influence that he didn't have. They mentioned legal difficulties, Nolan said thoughtfully. "What could they do legally?" Thomas sighed. "My land grant. It's old from before the territory was properly surveyed. If they challenge it in court, claim there are errors in the boundaries or the documentation, they could tie me up for years. Even if I win eventually, the legal fees would bankrupt me." "Then we need to prepare," Nolan said. "We need to find allies. People who will speak for us if it comes to that. I don't have many allies left. Most folks in town turned their backs on me." "Then we find new allies," Doba said simply. "Apache allies. Mexican allies. Anyone who knows that what the Carvers are doing is wrong." Thomas looked at the 3 of them, these women who'd come into his life by accident, who'd become so important to him in such a short time. They were willing to fight for this ranch, for this home they'd made together. How had he gotten so lucky? "All right," he said. "Tomorrow we start making plans. We reach out to anyone who might help. We prepare for whatever the Carvers do next, but tonight we rest. And we remember that we stood together. We didn't back down." "We will never back down," Nolan said quietly. "This is our home now. We will fight for it." The others nodded in agreement. Outside, the first light of dawn was starting to break over the hills. They'd survived the night. They'd faced down their enemies and sent them running. But Thomas knew this was just the beginning. The Carvers would come back with lawyers and legal papers instead of torches and threats. The real battle was yet to come. 3 weeks after the midnight confrontation, the legal papers arrived. A messenger from Santa Fe rode up to the ranch and handed Thomas an official-looking envelope with a wax seal. Thomas's hand shook as he read the contents. The Carver brothers were challenging his land grant. They claimed the original survey was incorrect and that part of his property, specifically the section with the creek that provided water for his cattle, actually belonged to them. There would be a hearing in Santa Fe in front of Judge Benjamin Blackwood in 30 days. Thomas felt his stomach drop. Judge Blackwood was known throughout the territory as a harsh man who had no love for Apache people. His only son had been killed in a raid about 8 years ago. Everyone knew he blamed all Apache for his loss, guilty or innocent. "We don't stand a chance with him," Thomas said that night as they all gathered to discuss the situation. "He'll see the sisters and make up his mind before we even start talking." "Then we need to change his mind," Nolan said firmly. "Or we need others to speak so loudly he has no choice but to listen." Over the next few weeks, they worked on 2 fronts. Thomas spent his time gathering every document he could find about his land grant, boundary markers, original surveys, anything that proved his ownership. Meanwhile, the sisters worked on something else. Nolan had been making quiet trips to Apache communities scattered throughout the territory. She'd been telling their story, about how a white rancher had given them shelter and protection, had stood by them against his own people. Word spread quickly through Apache families who'd learned to survive by helping each other. Julio helped too, spreading word through the Mexican settlements. His extended family was large and well respected. They remembered when Thomas had helped Julio's brother pay for medicine when his daughter was sick. They remembered fair treatment and honest dealing. The day of the hearing arrived cold and gray. Thomas hitched up his wagon and made the long trip to Santa Fe with the 3 sisters. He'd expected to arrive alone or maybe with Julio and Paco. What he found when they reached the courthouse made his eyes water. There were at least 30 Apache leaders waiting on the courthouse steps. Old men in traditional dress. Women who'd survived massacres. Young men trying to build new lives. They'd come from communities hundreds of miles away. Behind them stood Julio's family, at least 20 people including his elderly grandmother, who'd made the difficult journey despite her age. There were also 5 other ranchers, men who'd bought cattle from Thomas and found him honest in his dealings. Most surprising of all was Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house in Clearwater Ridge. She'd arrived the night before with something important. She was a widow herself, and she'd been close friends with Margaret, the original mail-order bride who died. Mrs. Henderson had Margaret's letters. Margaret wrote to me about everything, Mrs. Henderson explained, her voice trembling but determined. She wrote about wanting to help those Apache women after she met them at the fort. She admired their strength and was sad about what had happened to them. I have the letters. They prove she wanted to help them, that her dying wish was for them to have a chance at a good life. Thomas was overwhelmed. He thought he'd be standing alone. Instead, he had an army of supporters. The courtroom was packed. Judge Blackwood entered, a stern man in his 60s with gray hair and cold eyes. He looked at the crowd with obvious displeasure, especially when he saw how many Apache people were present. "This is highly irregular," he announced. "This is a simple property dispute. I don't know why half the territory has shown up." The Carver brothers and their expensive lawyer from St. Louis looked smug. They clearly thought the crowd would make no difference. Their lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Wilson, presented their case. He had fancy maps and survey documents that seemed to show errors in Thomas's land grant boundaries. The creek in question, Wilson argued, has always been part of the Carver property. An error was made in the original survey. My clients are simply claiming what is rightfully theirs. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he presented his documents. He showed purchase receipts, tax payments, water rights that went back 20 years. He showed how he'd maintained and improved the property. Then Nolan stood to testify. Judge Blackwood looked like he wanted to object, but technically she had a right to speak since she lived on the disputed property. Nayland described their arrangement with Thomas. She explained how they came to be there, about Margaret's death, about purchasing the contract. She spoke with such dignity and intelligence that even the judge seemed caught off guard. "And what is your relationship with Mr. Whitaker?" the Carver's lawyer asked with a smirk. "Are you his wife? His servant? What exactly?" "We are partners," Nolan said firmly. "We work his land. He provides protection and shelter. It is an honest arrangement built on respect." "Respect," Wilson scoffed. "Between a white rancher and Apache women? Forgive me if I find that hard to believe." That's when Julio's grandmother stood up. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, but when she spoke, everyone listened. In Spanish, which the judge's translator converted to English, she told a story. 3 years ago, my grandson's daughter was very sick. We had no money for a doctor. Mr. Whitaker, he gave us the money. He said we could pay him back when we could. We offered interest. He refused. He said family helps family. That is the kind of man he is. That is the man you are judging today. One by one, others stood to speak. An Apache elder talked about how rare it was for anyone to show kindness to their people, and how Thomas had done more than show kindness. He'd risked his reputation and his business to do what was right. One of the ranchers who'd bought cattle from Thomas testified that Thomas's stock was the healthiest he'd ever seen, that the man clearly knew how to run a proper ranch. Then Mrs. Henderson stood. She was nervous, her hands shaking as she held Margaret's letters. But her voice was clear. "Your Honor, Margaret was my dearest friend. When she decided to become a mail-order bride, she wrote to me about everything. I have her letters here. In them, she talks about meeting 3 Apache women at the fort who were being mistreated. She talks about how she wanted to help them. She writes, and I quote, 'If something should happen to me, I hope these brave women find their way to safety. They deserve kindness after all they've endured.'" The judge took the letters and read them carefully. For the first time, his stern expression softened slightly. Perhaps he was thinking about his own son, about loss and grief and how people respond to tragedy. The Carver's lawyer tried to dismiss it all. "This is very touching, but it has nothing to do with property boundaries. My clients have clear evidence that—" "Your clients have paperwork," Judge Blackwood interrupted, his voice sharp. "But this court has heard testimony about character, about truth, about what kind of men make claims against their neighbors." The judge looked at Thomas for a long moment, then at the 3 sisters, then at the crowd that had gathered to support them. Something seemed to shift in his expression. "I have reviewed all the documents," he said finally. "The survey maps, the land grants, the boundaries. And yes, there are some inconsistencies. But I have also reviewed 20 years of tax payments, improvements to the property, and water rights that have been continuously maintained by Mr. Whitaker." Thomas held his breath. "More importantly," the judge continued, "I have heard testimony about the character of the parties involved, and I have read letters from a woman who showed compassion in her final days. My own son was killed by Apache raiders. I have carried anger about that for 8 years. But these women did not kill my son. These women are simply trying to survive, just as my son was trying to survive that day." The judge's voice grew thick with emotion. "Hatred is easy. Revenge is easy. But justice requires us to look beyond our pain and see the truth. The truth is that Mr. Whitaker's land grant is valid. The creek belongs to him. The Carver brothers' claim is denied. The courtroom erupted. The Carvers jumped to their feet, shouting objections. Their lawyer demanded an appeal, but Judge Blackwood hammered his gavel. "Furthermore," he said loudly, "the Carver brothers will pay all court costs and legal fees, and they are hereby warned that any further harassment of Mr. Whitaker or his household will result in serious consequences." This court is adjourned. Thomas couldn't believe it. They'd won. Actually won. He looked at Nolan, and for the second time in their relationship he saw tears in her eyes. Outside the courthouse they were surrounded by supporters offering congratulations. Apache elders shook Thomas's hand and thanked him for his courage. Julio's grandmother hugged each of the sisters, speaking rapid Spanish that needed no translation. The Carver brothers pushed past them, their faces red with rage and humiliation. Robert stopped long enough to hiss at Thomas, "You haven't heard the last of this." But there was defeat in his eyes. They'd lost, publicly and completely. Mrs. Henderson pressed Margaret's letters into Nalen's hands. "She would have wanted you to have these. She would have been proud to know how strong you are." As they loaded into the wagon for the journey home, Thomas felt lighter than he had in months. The threat that had hung over them was gone. The ranch was secure. They'd stood together in court and won not just a legal battle, but something more important. They'd won respect. Winter settled over the ranch like a thick blanket. Snow came early that year, covering the brown grass and turning the whole world white and peaceful. The cattle huddled together for warmth in the sheltered valleys. The horses grew thick winter coats, and inside the buildings the people who called this place home prepared for the coldest months. Thomas had never been one for celebrating holidays much. When you live alone and work from sunrise to sunset every day, Christmas is just another day. But things were different now. The sisters had become part of his daily life in ways he couldn't have imagined back in August. They ate breakfast together every morning. They worked side by side during the day. They shared dinner in Thomas's house most evenings, talking about the day's work or making plans for spring. The walls between them had gradually dissolved until they felt less like employer and employees, and more like something else. Something Thomas didn't quite have words for yet. He'd noticed other changes too, especially in himself. He found himself watching Nolan when she wasn't looking, the way she concentrated when she was cooking, her face serious and focused, the way she laughed at something Kimmy said, a sound that was becoming more common. The way she looked at sunset, standing on the porch after a long day's work, her profile strong against the fading light. Thomas was 42 years old. He'd been alone for so long he'd almost forgotten what it felt like to care about someone, but he couldn't deny it anymore. He cared about Nolan, more than cared if he was honest with himself. The question was whether she felt anything similar. She was kind to him, respectful, even friendly now, but that didn't necessarily mean anything beyond appreciation for providing a safe home. December arrived cold and clear. One evening, about a week before Christmas, Thomas made a suggestion that surprised everyone, including himself. "We should get a Christmas tree. Decorate it. Make this place feel festive." The sisters looked at him curiously. "We do not celebrate Christmas," Nolan said carefully. "It is not our tradition, I know, but you're living in my world now. And in my world, people put up trees and make things nice for winter. Besides," he added with a small smile, "it might be good for all of us to have something to celebrate after the year we've had." Kimmy's eyes lit up. She was the youngest and still sometimes showed the enthusiasm that her sisters kept hidden. "I have seen Christmas trees in town. They are beautiful." "Then let's do it," Thomas said. "Tomorrow we'll ride up into the hills and find a good tree." The next day, all 5 of them went, including Julio and Paco, who'd come for the day's work. They rode up into the pine forest above the ranch where the snow was deeper and the air smelled like fresh sap in winter. Finding the right tree became an adventure. Kimmy wanted one that was perfectly shaped. Doba insisted it had to be strong enough to hold decorations. Nolan wanted one that wasn't too tall for the house. Julio and Paco mostly laughed at everyone's particular requirements. Finally, they found one that satisfied everyone, a nice pine about 7 feet tall, full and green. The men cut it down while the women gathered pine cones and holly branches for additional decorations. Getting the tree back to the ranch and set up in Thomas's living room took most of the afternoon. They didn't have fancy decorations like people in town might have, so they made their own. They strung popcorn and cranberries. They tied ribbons from old fabric. Nalin made small figures from corn husks. Kimmy carved small animals from wood scraps. As they worked together, decorating the tree, Thomas felt something warm spreading in his chest. This felt right. This felt like family. The house smelled like pine and cranberry. There was laughter and gentle teasing. Even Doba, who rarely showed emotion, smiled as she helped Kimmy hang her carved animals. Christmas Eve arrived quiet and cold. Julio and Paco had gone to spend the holiday with their families. The ranch was peaceful, with just Thomas and the three sisters. They'd worked shorter hours that day, and Nalin had prepared a special meal. Nothing fancy, but made with care. After dinner, they sat around the tree. The fire crackled in the fireplace. Outside, snow was falling softly, visible through the window in the lamplight. It was the kind of evening that felt suspended in time, peaceful and perfect. "This is nice," Kimmy said quietly. "I have not felt this peaceful in many years. Not since before." She didn't finish, but they all knew what she meant. Before the massacre, before their world was destroyed. "We have been lucky to find this place," Doba added, "to find someone who treats us as people, not as problems." Thomas felt embarrassed by the praise. "You've more than earned your place here. This ranch wouldn't be half of what it is without you." Nalin had been quiet, staring into the fire. Now she looked at Thomas with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Can I ask you something, Thomas?" "Of course. Why did you let us stay? That first day when we showed up instead of Margaret, you could have sent us away. Most men would have." "Why didn't you?" Thomas thought about it carefully. He'd asked himself the same question many times. "Honestly? At first I was just desperate. I needed help and you were there. But even then, I think I saw something in your eyes. You were scared but trying hard not to show it. You were asking for a chance, not charity. I respected that. And now?" Nalin asked softly. "Why do you want us to stay now?" "Because you're family," Thomas said simply. "Because this place is better with you here." "Because I'm better with you here." The room fell silent. Kimmy and Doba exchanged glances, then quietly excused themselves, saying they were tired and heading back to their cabin. Thomas suspected they were giving him and Nalin some privacy, though he wasn't sure why. After they left, Nalin and Thomas sat in silence for a while, watching the fire. Thomas's heart was pounding. He'd been thinking about this for weeks, trying to find the courage to say something. Maybe it was the holiday spirit. Maybe it was the warmth of the evening. Maybe he was just tired of being afraid. "Nalin," he began, his voice rough, "I need to tell you something, and I'm not good with words, so forgive me if this comes out wrong." She turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Go on." Thomas took a deep breath. "These past months, working with you, getting to know you, it's changed me. You've changed me. I started seeing you not just as someone who works here, but as someone I look forward to seeing every morning, someone whose opinion matters to me, someone whose smile makes my whole day better." Nalin's expression was unreadable, but she didn't interrupt. "I know this is probably not what you expected when you came here," Thomas continued, his words coming faster now, "and I know I'm just a struggling rancher with more problems than solutions. But I care about you, Nalin, more than I've cared about anyone in a very long time, and I was wondering if maybe possibly you might consider, well, being my wife. For real, not just a work arrangement." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Thomas's heart was hammering so hard he thought she might hear it. He'd put himself out there completely, and now he was terrified of what she might say. Nalin stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the falling snow. Thomas waited, barely breathing. "In my culture," she finally said, her back still to him, "marriage is not just between two people, it is between families. When someone marries, they marry into a whole family, taking on responsibility for everyone." Thomas felt his heart sink. Was she saying no? But Nalin turned to face him, and there were tears in her eyes. "If you ask me to marry you, Thomas, you are not just asking for me. You are asking for my sisters, too. You are taking responsibility for Doba and Kimmy, their safety, their future, their well-being. You are saying that this ranch, this home belongs to all of us equally, not just me." Thomas stood up and walked to her. I understand that. And yes, that's what I'm saying. When I think about my future, I see all three of you in it. This ranch, it's not just mine anymore. It's ours. All of ours. Do you know what you're asking? Nalan said, her voice shaking slightly. People already judge you for letting us stay here. If you marry me, if you make us truly part of your family, the judgment will be even worse. The gossip will never stop. Some people will never accept it. I don't care what they think, Thomas said firmly. I care what you think. I care what your sisters think. I care about the family we've built here together. Nalan studied his face for a long moment, searching for any sign of doubt or deception. You really mean this? All of it. Every word. She smiled then, a real smile that lit up her whole face. Then I need to talk to my sisters. This is not a decision I can make alone. In our way, all three of us must agree. Give me time to speak with them. Thomas nodded, though he felt both relieved and nervous. Take all the time you need. Nalan reached out and touched his hand gently just for a moment. Thank you for asking. Thank you for understanding what it means. Not many men would. She left then, heading back to the cabin through the snow. Thomas watched her go, then sat back down by the fire. His hands were shaking. He'd done it. He'd actually asked her, and she hadn't said no, not exactly. She'd said she needed to talk to her sisters. In the cabin, Nalan found Doba and Kimi waiting up for her, despite claiming they were tired. They knew something important had been happening. He asked me to marry him, Nalan said simply. Kimi gasped. Doba's eyebrows went up. What did you say? Kimi asked. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought warmth and new life to everything. The snow melted slowly, feeding the creek until it ran full and strong. The grass turned green almost overnight. The cattle grew fat and healthy, and the ranch, already improved by months of hard work, seemed to glow with possibility. Thomas and the sisters spent the winter months preparing for the wedding. It wasn't easy planning a ceremony that would honor both cultures, but they were determined to do it right. Nalan taught Thomas about Apache wedding traditions. Thomas explained the Christian ceremony that most people in the territory would expect. Together they created something new, something that belonged only to them. They decided to hold the wedding in May, when the weather would be warm and the wildflowers would be blooming. They invited everyone who'd stood by them during the courthouse battle. They invited Julio's family, the Apache elders who'd traveled to support them, Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house, and the ranchers who'd testified to Thomas's character. Word spread through the territory about the unusual wedding. Some people were scandalized. The new preacher in Clearwater Ridge, who'd replaced Reverend Hutchins after he moved away, spoke against it from his pulpit. The Carver brothers made sure everyone knew they thought it was a disgrace, but others were curious, even supportive. The world was changing even in this remote corner of New Mexico territory, and some people were ready to change with it. The day of the wedding arrived clear and beautiful. Thomas woke up nervous, his hands shaking as he tried to button his good shirt. He'd bought it special for the occasion, along with new pants and boots. He wanted to look worthy of the woman he was about to marry. Julio and Paco helped him get ready, joking and trying to calm his nerves. Boss, you are shaking like a leaf, Julio laughed. She already said yes, the hard part is over. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I mess up the Apache words Nalan taught me? Then you mess up, Paco said practically. She will still be your wife at the end of the day. That is what matters. Out in the cabin, the three sisters were preparing together. Nalan wore a dress that combined both worlds. The style was traditional white, something that would be recognized by the non-Apache guests. But it was decorated with Apache beadwork and symbols that Doba and Kimi had spent months creating. The result was stunning, something that belonged to no one culture but represented all of who Nalan was. Kimi wore a blue dress, simpler, but still beautiful. Doba wore green. They would stand beside Nalan during the ceremony, not as bridesmaids, in the traditional sense, but as equal partners in this union, because that's what this marriage meant. It wasn't just Thomas and Nalan joining their lives, it was all four of them becoming a family officially. By noon, people started arriving. The ceremony would take place outside, in a meadow near the ranch house where wildflowers grew thick and colorful. Someone had to go into town to tell the curious crowds that yes, anyone could come and watch, as long as they were respectful. Thomas wanted this to be public, wanted no question about the legitimacy of his marriage and his family. About 60 people showed up. The Apache elders sat in places of honor. Julio's entire extended family came, grandmother and all. Mrs. Henderson arrived wearing her best dress. Even a few people from town came, including the new schoolteacher and the doctor, both of whom had quietly supported Thomas when others turned their backs. The Carver brothers didn't come, but that was fine with everyone. A traveling priest had agreed to perform the ceremony. He was an older man, weathered and kind, who'd seen enough of the world to be less judgmental than most. He stood in the meadow, his Bible in hand, waiting. As Thomas took his place, he saw the three sisters emerge from the cabin. His breath caught in his throat. Nalin was beautiful, more beautiful than he'd ever imagined. The sunlight caught in her dark hair. Her eyes met his across the distance, and she smiled. The ceremony began with the priest reading traditional Christian vows. Thomas and Nalin repeated the words, promising to love and honor each other. But then they did something different. They turned to face Doba and Kimi. Thomas spoke first, using the Apache phrases Nalin had taught him. His pronunciation wasn't perfect, but his sincerity was clear. He promised to protect them, to honor them, to treat them as true family. He vowed that this ranch would be their home always, that they would have equal say in all decisions. Then, in a moment that made many in the crowd cry, Doba and Kimi spoke their own vows. They promised to support this union, to help build the family, to stand together through whatever challenges came. In Apache culture, this wasn't strange at all. Family was everything, and family took care of family. The priest looked a bit uncertain about this part, as it wasn't in any ceremony book he'd ever read, but he blessed all four of them anyway, recognizing that sometimes the spirit of love and family matters more than strict tradition. When the priest finally said, "You may kiss your bride," Thomas cupped Nalin's face gently and kissed her. It was sweet and tender, full of promise. The crowd cheered and clapped, but the ceremony wasn't quite over. Following Apache tradition, the four of them tied a white blanket around their shoulders, symbolizing their unity. They shared bread and water, representing their commitment to sustain each other through good times and hard times. Then came the celebration. Tables had been set up with food from both cultures. There was traditional ranch fare, beef and beans and cornbread. But there was also food the sisters had prepared, dishes from their childhood, flavors that many of the guests had never tasted before. Music started up. Someone had brought a fiddle. Someone else had a guitar. People danced and ate and celebrated under the spring sky. Apache elders told stories. Julio's grandmother sang old Mexican songs. The new schoolteacher, a young woman from back east, talked excitedly about how this was the most interesting wedding she'd ever attended. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas found himself standing with his new wife and her sisters, watching their guests enjoy themselves. "We did it," Nalin said quietly. "We actually did it." "Are you happy?" Thomas asked. She looked at him and her smile was answer enough. "Happier than I thought possible. We have a home. We have family. We have a future. Yes, I am happy." The years that followed brought both challenges and joys. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Thomas's cattle became known throughout the territory for their quality. Buyers came from as far away as Colorado to purchase stock from the Whitaker Ranch. The town of Clearwater Ridge slowly, grudgingly, began to accept the unusual family. It helped that Thomas's success was hard to ignore. It helped that the sisters proved themselves to be good neighbors, always willing to help when someone was in need. When Doba helped rescue a child who'd fallen down a well, using her incredible strength to lift heavy beams, people started seeing her as more than just one of those Apache women. When Kimi's skill with horses became legendary, when ranchers from 3 territories came to buy animals she'd trained, it was harder to dismiss her as a savage. When Nalin's medicine saved Mrs. Henderson's life during a bad fever, the older woman made sure everyone in town knew about it. Doba eventually married Julio. It was a courtship conducted mostly in Spanish that Doba learned phonetically, mixing her halting Spanish with Julio's improving English, creating a language all their own. They had 3 children who grew up bilingual and bicultural, comfortable in all worlds. Kimmy never married. She said she didn't need a husband when she had her horses and her family. She built a reputation as the best horse trainer in the territory. People brought their most difficult animals to her, and she always found a way to reach them. She built a separate barn on the property just for her training work. Thomas and Nalan had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. They grew up speaking both English and Apache. They learned their mother's traditions and their father's ways. They knew the stories of both cultures. They were living proof that families could be built from love and choice, not just blood. As the children grew, the ranch grew with them. More buildings were added. More land was acquired. The property that the Carver brothers had tried so hard to steal became one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Years passed. Thomas's hair turned gray, then white. Lines appeared on Nalan's face, but she remained strong and capable. Doba's strength never seemed to fade. Kimi's way with horses only improved with age. They faced prejudice that never fully went away. There were always some people who couldn't accept their family, but they also found allies and friends. They built a community of people who valued character over background, who saw strength in diversity. When Thomas was 70 years old, sitting on his porch watching his grandchildren play, he thought back to that August day when 3 Apache sisters had stepped off a wagon instead of the mail-order bride he'd expected. He'd been so shocked, so confused, so uncertain. If someone had told him then what his life would become, he never would have believed it. A family that blended cultures, children who grew up knowing they belonged to 2 worlds, a ranch that prospered because different kinds of knowledge and strength came together. "What are you thinking about?" Nalan asked, sitting down beside him. She was 68 now, her hair mostly gray.